Unity song.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I say welcome back because this is like the second installment on the first video that I did, reacting as so many Canadians and residential school survivors have to conservative Senator Lynn Bayak's remarks on how we should focus on the good done by these residential schools, otherwise known as prisons, akin to the Nazi concentration camps in Europe, where, yes, Hitler did exactly that. You see, he was studying his enemy very carefully and saw how governments north and south of the border treated their undesirables. My close friend Victoria shares her thoughts with us. She says, a grandmother shared the story of when the men came to the village and took the children away. So imagine if a group of foreign men came and took away all the children from your town. There would be grieving, suffering, anger, and trauma beyond belief. I've heard stories from my brothers of what happened to them when they were taken away from their families and put into boarding schools. In the 1800s, in Canada, first Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald wanted to finish his transcontinental railway across the country, and he put what he called the Northwest Mounted Police in force. Today, they're called the RCMP, and instructed them to do basically two tasks. One was the clearing of 50 miles on either side of this railway of Indians, and the other was the responsibility of going into the villages and taking away the children from their families, often by force, to be put in these new schools run by church and state, and also to go hunt them down when they escaped from these schools, to do what they wanted with them, just to bring them back to the institutions. And these were not schools. These were prisons. By order of Sir John A. Macdonald, Duncan Campbell Scott, who they call the Indian Killer, he was the superintendent of Indian Affairs at the time. We're going to talk about him a bit later. This is what he said. I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that this country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole objective of this bill. That was in 1920. The idea was to place them by force in these prisons for one purpose only, to teach them their place as menials, as slaves to the white colonial society. with only enough education perhaps to read a manual or do laundry or cook or use a shovel, and to never aspire to have any hope whatsoever of becoming anything else. Upon arrival, they would be stripped of everything resembling their culture and their way of life, medicine bags given to them by their parents, everything ripped off of them and thrown into the fire. I was going to go right into part 2, but I said to myself, and Victoria and I spoke about this and decided together that maybe we should just make a little parentheses here really quick, just to explain how difficult it is for me at the present time to speak about stuff like this, to address the pain and suffering of my red brothers and sisters, and to speak about the unspeakable horrors that that my brothers and sisters went through. And Victoria has offered some beautiful paintings to give us insight into healing, into the positive way to deal with these issues, and how to be able to make it so that they make us stronger. And I have a direct link to this genocide as well, because of the genocide that happened in Europe. My mother is German, my father's Italian, and my grandmother and my mother had to hide under the axles of a train and watch the Gestapo goose-step their way by, asking the passengers for papers. So we came very close ourselves. My ancestors came very close to being locked up in those residential schools or those prisons or those concentration camps in Europe. So maybe that's the intergenerational trauma, they call it, that I'm going through when I talk about this stuff. I got really cold, and it was horrible going through part 1. So I took out my sage, and I smudged, and I asked for prayers. I asked for healing for everybody that's going through the same thing. And intergenerational trauma is real. Generations down the road can go through the same horrors, the same trauma, feeling the same abuse, the same shame, the same side effects as people that have gone through that, their ancestors that have gone through that generations before. So just something to think about as we slowly inch our way into part 2. I hope. So pure and sacred are the thoughts of our mother, the earth, that her hair grows long and fragrant. The sweet grasses found growing around the world represent the hair of our mother, the earth. These special grasses have long been collected by the native peoples of earth to use as incense, in other words, to perceive by the senses. For physical and spiritual healing, celebrations, sacred prayer, and purification rites. Loving all her children, the earth allows us to share in her loving intent and her perfect and purifying thoughts. On the medicine wheel, sweetgrass sits in the north position, the place of water and consciousness, the place of the minder of the universe and the soul of man. As Native people walk the sacred path of Creator God, our hair, the physical extension of our thoughts, allows for our direction along the path of life. Upon arrival to these residential schools, first thing, the hair was cut, Victoria continues. They were not allowed to speak their language or practice their own traditions and customs. The children were often beaten, often sexually abused, or even killed. If you tried to run away, you were chased down. And if you were caught, you were returned to the boarding school and face even harsher punishment to the enjoyment of the staff of these evil institutions. In one instance, two sisters managed to escape from their school, but they didn't get very far. They were captured like dogs and brought back to the school, only to be thrown into a darkened room for 72 hours without food or water, Dr. Roland Christian retells. What happened to them? Well, after their ordeal and their parading in front of this fraudulent Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they were awarded $3,000 for the abuse that they suffered until they reviewed it. And then they found that because the two sisters were put together in the darkened room, that did not constitute abuse or solitary confinement. So they took back the $3,000. I remember one evening, we were all lined up in a room, and one of the boys said something Indian to another boy. The man in charge caught him by the shirt and threw him across the room. Later, we found out his collarbone was broken. The boy's father, an old warrior, came to the school. He told the instructor that among his people, children were never punished by striking them, that was no way to teach children. Kind words and good examples were much better. Lone Wolf, Blackfeet. The priest would take a leather harness strap and he would beat my husband. And every time that strap would come down on him, he would repeat to himself, "I will never forget my language. I will never forget my language." He was thinking that, "I will never forget my language." Some of the children in these schools were so severely abused and scared into submission that they could not even remember their own mother's name in their own traditional language. Dr. Peter Bryce, a medical doctor and inspector at the Canadian residential schools in the early 1900s, he was appalled at what he saw. Death rates in these schools often higher than 60% in some cases, the sick children housed along with the healthy ones. And he declared this horror in one newspaper article in the Ottawa Citizen in 1909, calling this a national crime, which would later be the title of his book that he would write. But his boss, Duncan Campbell Scott, the so-called czar of Indian affairs for over 40 years at that time, decided to smear Bryce's reputation and make it so that he could no longer work in the field of medicine again. Tactics that we hear more and more of, done to the people who dare expose truth in government operations, then and now. These crimes continue to this day, unabated. Not only were young women and young girls sexually assaulted, Victoria recounts, but they were used as sex slaves. We're going to talk about that a little bit more at the end of the program. One woman shared how, along with all the other abuses, many of the young girls were also sterilized around age 12, so they would never be able to have children of their own. If they were not sterilized and did become pregnant, the babies were taken from them, or they were brought downstairs and thrown into the furnace of the school, burned alive. One hospital that we do know of is called the Bella Bella Hospital in Alberta, where women would be told to go for a routine procedure, and then they would wake up, as the story goes, and they found themselves bleeding from between the legs, and their gold teeth would be missing. Some even say that an SS tattoo was on one of the doctor's arms. Food for thought. The indigenous people often lack the enzymes to digest dairy products and wheat and other foods, my friend Victoria adds. So if they were fed milk, cheese, bread, cereal, etc., then they would have reactions, celiac disease, gluten allergies, milk tolerance, nutritional deficits, etc. When Edmund Metatawabin was 5 years old, he was sent to a remote church-run school for Aboriginal children in Canada, where he and hundreds of others say they faced years of abuse and torture. Metatawabin spent about 10 years at the school, beginning in the 1950s. One morning, he says, he was feeling ill and threw up while eating porridge. He says he was slapped and told to go upstairs. When he felt better, 4 days later, he went back to the dining hall and was forced to eat his own vomit. I was given that porridge I got sick on, he says, and I had to eat that. And if you don't eat, then you're going to get beat up some more, and you're going to get punished. And if you throw up again, you're going to have to eat that too. So what choice do you have? Metatawabin, now 66, says at times he and his classmates were forced to sit in an electric chair, either as punishment or as entertainment for passing dignitaries, or for the staff at the St. Anne's Indian Residential School, which operated from the early 1900s to 1976 in the northern part of the province of Ontario. Now, Metatawabin says, the government is hiding information about the school. Again, Victoria poses some very important questions. Did boarding schools guarantee that the child would then be accepted into European non-native society? Were they welcomed into communities, treated with respect, accepted as suitors or spouses for the white young men and women? Were they then encouraged to set up businesses, join churches, run for political offices, etc.? Would the children coming out of these boarding schools be functional, emotionally stable, and well-adjusted? The information in this video is twofold. In most cases, the attendees in these schools were traumatized for life. Some committed suicide, others so severely scarred were and still are discarded or homeless, or worse, alcoholics or drug addicts, anything to hide the pain and suffering. The last school closed its doors in 1996. One case we need to share tells of how those successfully completing the school curriculum, the assimilation process, come back and try to persuade the Indians just arriving to these schools. One would call this psychological manipulation or even torture. And it's also interesting to note that those who did successfully graduate from these schools are indeed the lawyers or chief or council members aiding in this ongoing genocidal process. Boarding school graduates returned to the schools and encouraged the new students, fresh from the reservations, to give up their traditions. Don't look back, they said. All that has passed away. This country through here is all improved. You saw when you were coming in, cities, railroads, houses, manufactories. Boys, this was all once our country, but our fathers had not their eyes open as we have. The only way to hold our land now is to get educated ourselves. Henry Jones, Creek. But sadly, and so heartbreaking, most could not even find their place among their own ever again, as the changes were too deeply rooted and resentment and shaming took the stage, as when the schools did close, the students would try and find their way back home. Son Elk from the Taos Nation explains. It was a warm summer evening when I got off the train at Taos Station. The first Indian I met, I ran up to him and I asked him to go to the Pueblo and tell my family I was home. The Indian could not speak English, and I had forgotten my Pueblo language. The next morning, the governor of the Pueblo and two war chiefs come into my father's house. They did not talk to me. They did not even look at me. The chief said to my father, "Your son who calls himself Raphael, he's lived with the white man. He has been far away. He has not learned the things that Indian boys should learn. He has no hair. He cannot even speak our language. He is not one of us. Sun elk, Tahoes. And the second scenario that needs to be addressed, since we are speaking of Sun elk and also the Creek Nation, it begs to be mentioned that the United States played their huge part in the residential school saga. One of the most notorious and well-known was the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania, founded in 1879 with its director, Richard Pratt, who made his agenda very clear. Kill the Indian, save the man, he would say. Or, this is a new one I never even knew before, in Indian civilization, I am the Baptist, because I believe in immersing the Indians in our civilization, and when we get them under, holding them there until they are thoroughly soaked. Ironically, he would be called the Red Man's Moses.
Honorable Senators, I rise today to address Inquiry 19 of Senator Kim Pate, the knowledgeable and thoughtful inquiry that she issued here a few weeks ago. I want to present a somewhat different side of the residential school story. Far too many Indigenous people, especially women, are incarcerated in Canada today, and like everyone in this chamber, I seek to find solutions. Today, I will take a broad look at several timely Indigenous issues that are before us. I speak partly for the record, but mostly in memory of the kindly and well-intentioned men and women and their descendants, perhaps some of us here in this chamber, whose remarkable works, good deeds, and historical tales in the residential schools go unacknowledged for the most part and are overshadowed by negative reports. Obviously, the negative issues must be addressed, but it is unfortunate that they are sometimes magnified and considered more newsworthy than the abundance of good. It is because of the less partisan nature of the Senate that we have the ability to look at issues a bit more objectively, to take that second sober look that sometimes gets missed in the theatrics of politics. Honorable colleagues, I want to first acknowledge the excellent work undertaken by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Mistakes were made at residential schools, in many instances horrible mistakes that overshadowed some good things that also happened at those schools.
An angry Victoria concludes. So when a politician states we should look at the good things that the boarding schools provided, perhaps the politician might like to be kidnapped, raped, beaten, forced to speak a different language, eat intolerable foods, be treated as a slave, threatened with death, sterilized against their will, and then traumatized in every way possible. Once having gone through all of this, maybe then we can hear about the good things that the children of the boarding schools were provided.
I wouldn't have characterized it as an apology at all. It was an attempt to, mollify a few people, maybe even me in a certain sense, since I've been complaining about it for quite some time. But it was supposed to, I say, keep hitting me over the head with it. Everybody, they keep hitting over the head with it. That this closes a bad chapter and it's time to move on, and so on and so on. And in my opinion, I didn't hear what I needed to hear, and it doesn't constitute an apology. So if somebody sets fire to my house and says, "Well, I'm sorry, I kind of upset you," that's not an apology. They didn't apologize for what they actually did, and they put it all on me. Oh, I'm upset. That's what the problem is, not that a crime was committed. And the word that Harper and everybody else is studiously avoiding is genocide. What they want to suggest is that somehow the difficulty with the residential school was that the residential school caused upset in the lives of the individual children that were taken away, and maybe the parents from whom the children were taken away. And that's the beginning and end of it. And there are reasons why Harper decided to present the difficulties of the residential school in sort of tabular form the way that he did, which also avoids putting the residential school policies in the context of other policies that were part of an entire program of an elimination of First Nations. The United Nations Genocide Convention was articulated in 1948. There was a conference in upstate New York. Canada and the United States conspired. There's another way of putting it. The man who invented the term genocide, Raphael Lemkin, showed up uninvited. He wasn't a member of any government. But since it was his word, and he was the one who invented it, he thought he should have some say in the United Nations going along with it. Now, if you read Lemkin's writing, and by the way, there's more and more scholarship on Lemkin's work. Lemkin was Jewish and was writing about the Holocaust and actually coined the term genocide with respect to what the Nazis were doing. He wrote a pamphlet in 1944 where he uses the term. But the scholarship on Lemkin shows quite convincingly that Lemkin's notion of what genocide was based on his analysis of the colonial governments in Canada, the United States, in Tasmania, and in Australia. As far as he was concerned, it was a genocidal act of colonialism that gave rise to the notions of genocide. And in his writings, he talked, in his proposals, he actually says that physical genocide, killing people, is rather marginal and certainly unnecessary, that the most important aspects of genocide are social, cultural forms of life attacks. So anyway, he showed up with a draft of what he would consider to be an international law, and a lot of countries wanted to adopt it, but it was Canada and the United States that got it moderated into what it is today. And if you read under today, I'll quote directly from it, Article 2 under the UN Genocide Convention says, "In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such." And then it lists 5 different things. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group's conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, you can dispute a lot of things about the residential school, but you can't dispute Section E, that's exactly what the Canadian government legislated. That's exactly what they instructed the RCMP and child welfare agencies provincially to carry out. Go and take the children away from their parents, their communities, and put them under the control of the churches. So the Canadian government not only legislated it, the churches implemented it. If you look under Article 3, which comes immediately afterwards, it says, the following acts shall be punishable: A, genocide; B, conspiracy to commit genocide; C, direct and public incitement to commit genocide; D, attempt to commit genocide; and E, complicity in genocide. And Article 4 says, persons committing genocide or any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3 shall be punished whether they are constitutionally responsible rulers, public officials, or private individuals. So again, the church members are all culpable for participating in a genocide. The members of the government are all culpable for committing genocide. The other thing that's left out of this is that covering up a crime is also a crime. And so the roadblocks that the Canadian government continue to throw up to the understanding that what happened in the residential school was genocide is complicity. They have been complicit in trying to create the impression in the Canadian public that, oh, well, the residential schools was maybe an unfortunate thing, that a few bad apples caused bad things to happen, but it was done with the best of intentions, and the Indians should stop complaining about it. This is one of my big objections to this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Indians now have to parade in front of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission like they've already paraded in front of the Royal Commission and Aboriginal people to argue that genocide is bad. Who else had to do that? Was there a big, long discussion about whether or not what Hitler did to the Jews during World War II was a bad thing? Let's decide whether that's bad, and then we'll decide whether or not we're going to have trials at Nuremberg or whatever. I mean, everybody else in the world, when you find out that genocide is involved, says that's a bad thing. It's a no-brainer. It's an automatic. Except when it happens to the Indians. When you carry out a genocide on the Indians, then we have to decide whether or not the intentions were proper and whether or not it was a serious enough genocide that the Indians really have something to complain about. And nobody is talking about taking criminal responsibility. What Harper was talking about was, well, we're kind of sorry for the mistakes that we made. No, that was a crime. And you don't get out of a crime by apologizing for it.
Welcome back. So until this point, we searched through history. We saw the intent behind these residential schools. We visited them and we heard horror stories from survivors. Now we're witness to people in the same government trying to minimize the devastating effects of these policies towards the Indian nations. First, a fake apology in 2008, then a moron standing up to defend these so-called good things that came out of these schools, and finally, a personal acquaintance of mine, a PhD, who wants to, quote, undo all the harm that he's done to those he touched in his career, end quote. So all this brings us up to the epilogue, the last chapter in this program, in which we see all of this continues. As we said, the same song played with different instruments. And we mentioned some of them. So here's part 3, the epilogue, as we touch on the tools of genocide, of assimilation, of extermination, of oppression, among others. When the indigenous people were forced onto the reservations, Victoria tells us, the men were not allowed to hunt or to protect their women, their children, and their elders. The tools of genocide were many: assimilation, extermination, oppression, victimization. At the time of the residential schools, and even before, the right to practice and to celebrate their traditions, their ceremonies, and their culture were taken away, and the people could be put to death for practicing them. The holy people, or the medicine people, were targets to be eliminated, locked away, or to be put to death, because they were the greatest threat, for they were the keepers of this now forbidden knowledge. The deliberate decimation of the culture, the teachings, the ceremonies, the ways of parenting, the destroying of families, the loss of loved ones, all this would traumatize the indigenous people as it put an end to their ways of life that they had lived for thousands of years. The trauma, the pain, and the hopelessness would lead to depression, alcoholism, abusive behaviors to the self and to others. This was done by Europeans, the non-native culture, the invaders, those who professed to be practicing Christianity, the missionaries, the Anglicans, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Protestants, the Catholics, and many more. These invaders demanded that the indigenous people turn to and accept Christianity, the belief in this white man's God, as their own belief system. There was no getting around it. It was forced on them. And by the way, we never saw one Indian force their way on the invaders. We never heard of that. That's an interesting one. That's another video. The Indians were told that the spirits, the gods, and the ceremonies in which they believed since time immemorial were evil and of the devil, and they had to be destroyed. The invaders almost succeeded. In some movies like The Mission with Robert De Niro or The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, these are not exaggerations. As a matter of fact, they didn't speak loud enough of this oppression. And the non-natives were afraid of the original people's belief system. There's a beautiful Indian saying that I want to share with you, very powerful one. It goes something like this: go to the forest and speak to the animals. If you go to the forest and speak with them, they will come and greet you and be with you. Do not be afraid. If you do not go to the forest or go to the animals, you will not know them. And what you do not know, you fear. And what you fear, you tend to need to destroy. And if you don't think all of this is going on today, just look around you. I mentioned this in my introduction in this program. The same song still played with different instruments. Look at the blatant racism towards the original people, how it never stopped, and in some cases, it worsened. Look at the so-called man camps, mostly in Canada's north, where practically no one can see or enforce anything. Look at the missing and murdered Aboriginal women in both Canada and the United States. Look at Standing Rock. Perfect example. The illegalities, the brutalization, the corruption, the victimization that's still alive and well as thugs laugh and joke as they target the unarmed water protectors' groins, faces, genital areas, and backs as they run away. Look at the Indian children still being taken from their families, now called legal kidnapping from social services and/or child protection agencies, and placed in non-native foster homes. Just yesterday, countercurrentnews.com came out with an article stating the following, and I quote, "Removal of Indian children from their homes appears to be a lucrative business in South Dakota to the tune of almost $100 million a year, according to a 2011 NPR investigation. That's not including adoption incentive bonus paid to the state when they move kids to foster care and into adoption, about $4,000 a child." Something to think about. Thank you so much for watching.